Today, we're going to be looking at the progressive movement and the way in which middle class reformers tried to transform the urban environment during the first part of the 20th century. You've seen this picture before. This is downtown Chicago in the first 3 or 4 years of the 20th century. And the question that progressives were asking is the environment in some way shaping the behavior and the problems that the city was creating? And so if you think about the question that is being presented here, is this environment bad for you? The progressives would say, absolutely, it's bad. This is what a city looks like in a laissez-faire environment. Remember, laissez-faire means you just let things go, let things just be. It's disordered, it's chaotic, it's filled with crime, it's filled with lots of social problems. So if you look at the social problems of the first part of the 20th century, they were numerous. So if you look at the tenement houses, you had overcrowding. You had children working in sweatshops or children playing in the streets and not going to school. You had large numbers of men living in areas where they were in boarding houses, like in the upper right. So you had poverty, and poverty led to crime, not just petty crime in the streets, but organized crime. You have their children playing next to a dead horse. So you've got problems with trash collection. You have problems with prostitution. You have problems involving everything from trash collection itself to larger issues of laws, zoning laws, which are laws that involve how houses can be built, problems with sewage, all kinds of issues here. But the biggest issue here was if you don't regulate the environment, then you can expect bad behavior. So who were these progressives anyway? If you look at this picture, obviously on the lower left, you've got the immigrants. Remember that those new immigrants were coming from Southeastern Europe, Italians, Austrians, Russians, Greeks, and they were all non-English speaking, non-Protestant, darker skinned peoples. And they were largely working class. They were people that brought poverty, they brought cultural difference, and they were numerous in parts of the city, and large parts of the city were basically dominated by them. If you look at the upper right, you also then have the plutocrats. The plutocrats were the people who were dominating the government and the society. These were very rich people who ran the corporations, who were basically running away with all of the wealth. And then in the middle, you have these middle-class people, and they were generally well-educated. Many of them were women. And they felt a kind of status anxiety. They clearly were threatened both by the immigrants and by these super rich people. And so what the progressives were trying to do is to bring some semblance of middle class reform. They wanted to bring order back to the city. And for women particularly, this was something that they could do because while they still couldn't vote, then they were considered to be people who would be better suited to working in the home. They began to develop this idea of municipal housekeeping, which was this idea that, okay, well, if the city is like the house and the house is out of order, then the women should be the ones putting it back in order. So the status anxiety wasn't just class status, it was also gender status. So women who were feeling both left out of the social environment in terms of social class and in terms of gender. So to what extent does the environment create the social problems? And should the reform focus be on character developments or the broader environmental changes? The answer was for progressive reformers, both. We first need to reform the individuals, and the best way to reform individuals is to educate them. So we are going to begin to look at mandatory public schooling and the importance of teaching English and Americanization, and not just teaching kids how to learn, but also teaching them basic habits, things like how to brush their teeth and wash their hair, and everything from hygiene to the culture of the United States. On the other side, on the right side, the urban improvements are going to include everything that involves the cleaning up of the city. So street cleaners, trash collection, sewage collection, mandatory vaccinations, all these sorts of things that are going to help improve the health and quality of the city. Zoning laws, right, laws about how houses can be built, all these sorts of things. So if you look at the urban problems and the solutions, for every urban problem, there was a progressive solution. I've mentioned a few of them already. But this idea was, we've got, just to mention a few of the things, we've got class divisions, so we're going to have to change the tax system. We have problems with immigration, so we're going to have more assimilation, more Americanization. A third urban problem, as I just mentioned, was we have overcrowding, so we're going to have to put new laws in and around how we deal with building things. Now, in the middle of the progressive movement was something called the Settlement House movement. And the Settlement House movement was led by a woman named Jane Addams, and you can see her there in the lower right. And Jane Addams was a woman who really felt out of place as a young woman. She was, at least she felt herself to be kind of a misfit. She considered herself to be not particularly attractive. She was a bit pigeon-toed, so she couldn't really play sports. She had problems with a bent back. And so she lived through the Civil War and saw a lot of the inequalities at the time, and went over to England and saw the slums and factories there, and saw that the English were beginning to try to engage in this reform movement. So she took this idea and she basically used the money that she had. She obviously came from a wealthy family, and she was very connected to her father, who saw that she was very self-disciplined and had a goal. So her dad said, well, why don't you go get a college degree, which she tried and wasn't really all that excited about school. So she, along with her father's help, bought this Hull House, which was a large house in the middle of Chicago, built between a saloon and an undertaker. So it was right in the middle of the center part of the immigrant community in Chicago. And as you can see from the inside of it, there was a large dining room and there was a large living area. And the idea was to bring immigrants into this house. It was like introducing them to the values of an everyday middle class life. So how you eat, things from like table manners. There were schools involved. There's all kinds of different programs that were being offered by Hull House. So Hull House was really the beginning of the modern sense of social work. So she was a social worker, and she worked with other women, another woman named Ellen Gates Starr, who she had a relationship with. And so there was within the progressive movement, because it was a women's movement, a certain amount of bisexuality and lesbian activity as well. But basically Hull House was a lot of young middle-class women who were doing all of these different things for the immigrant community. And it began with children. So it began with kindergarten, right? Kindergarten meaning the education of young people, and many, many different other things. So things like evening classes for workers, teaching them English in the American government, hygiene, as we mentioned before, health education, child rearing, boarding houses for women that didn't have places to be, cooking clubs and summer school, all these sorts of things. So it was basically a way to reform the immigrant community, starting with the kids themselves. Here's some more pictures, teaching municipal housekeeping. So again, women coming in and teaching kids to bathe and teaching them to eat and giving them basic education. In addition to that, you saw the progressive movement moving out into the public spaces. So when you look at playgrounds, the parks used to be places where animals would graze in the 19th century. And then after that, places where people would picnic. But in the progressive era, these were places where young men and women would get exercise, usually in single-sex groups. So the women would go out and they would exercise, and the men would. And this was very regimented, as you can see. Calisthenics, you can see the playground in the upper left, kids in circles, highly regimented ways of playing and teaching kids how to play so that they could develop the right habits of mind and the right habits of character. So just as there was this idea of reforming the children, there was also the idea of reforming the city itself. So one of the most amazing examples of this was the Columbian Exhibition of 1893, which was the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage. This was an extraordinary 600-acre model city, which was basically illustrating what happens if you could essentially design a city from scratch. So a bunch of architects came together and built this giant city with these neoclassical buildings that looked like something you'd see in Greece. These were absolutely enormous buildings. So the building on the lower right that you see with the big dome was basically a museum to the art of manufacturing and liberal arts. This, if it were standing today, would be the third largest building in the United States. It's absolutely enormous. So there were all these exhibits, and basically this was teaching Americans about technology and architecture and religion, and all of these triumphs of basically engineering. And so the idea here was if you could bring everyone into this city, it was called the White City because the industrial city was dark and ominous and threatening. The question was, would the behavior change if you lived here? And interestingly enough, there wasn't a lot of crime in this city. This was not a place where people lived. It was more like an amusement park, but people would go there during the day. But the crime rates were very low. And so the reformers said, well, hey, look, you changed the urban environment. Seems like you changed the behavior. In the middle of this city, though, this is what the progressives wanted. They wanted people to have all this uplifting kind of museum-like experience. But what people were really interested in was the place called the Midway, which was basically the origin of the modern amusement park. You know, they wanted the roller coasters and the Ferris wheels and things like that. And this Ferris wheel, as you can tell, was absolutely gigantic. It was built to show the power of steel. The bike spokes that you can see there, actually bike spokes are the design of them comes from this Ferris wheel, because this Ferris wheel had 36 passenger cars, each one which could carry about 60 people. So it literally could carry almost 2,000 people at a time. And so it was an amazing exercise in engineering, but it also was a lot of fun for people. So they went to the Midway instead of to the White City. And that was a little disappointing to the reformers. Americans were more interested in having fun than being good. Other things that happened with the progressives is they built a lot of parks. And the idea here was to introduce people, get them out of the city and into rural environments, because they felt like these rural environments in a sort of Jeffersonian sense would get you back to a more pure state of mind and better behavior. So again, this is Central Park, which had a skating rink, and it had boating opportunities, and it had large places for people to be outside. So the idea was if you get them back into nature, they would be better human beings. You see this also in the Gilded Age, these planned communities, these summer camps for the rich. And these were places where the upper middle class and the rich would go in the summer to basically vacation together. And these places still exist in places like Squam, New Hampshire, Northeast Harbor, Maine. And these were vacation colonies, but places that you didn't just go on vacation. You would go and you'd hear lectures and you'd get educated and you'd do things that were, again, uplifting. Another example of this, baseball. Progressives love baseball. Right? You have to listen to the umpire and you have to follow directions, and you are back in a rural environment. It's a Jeffersonian environment. Same thing with football. Football was also trying to redevelop the masculine virtues of toughness and physicality in a world where the urban environment was taking some of those things away. And finally, you have the parks movement. So you have the desire to move Americans out into rural settings. So millions of acres of land. That's Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, who was a progressive reformer. And together they're trying to get Americans to get back to nature. The final part of the progressive movement was the Americanization movement, making Americans making immigrants American again. And so all these things together worked to form the progressive movement, a way to transform America.